Hello and welcome. So I'm going to give this talk at a local meetup, and I figured I'd make a recording of it as well. Help me trial it, and I figured I'd probably put it on YouTube or something. So this talk is called WordPress Security for Users, WordPress Security for Site Owners. The core differentiator of it is we aren't going to get into PHP at all. There's no expectation that you understand PHP. We won't talk about PHP. We won't talk about more complicated PHP-focused things like what's SQL injection and what's a cross-site scripting vulnerability. Those are things that we're going to assume we don't need to worry about as people who aren't writing PHP on a regular basis, and we're going to leave those concerns to other people, and instead we're going to focus on what I need as someone who owns one or many WordPress sites and maintains one or many WordPress sites. So with that, I'm David Hayes. I often put a B in the middle of it, so David B. Hayes, that's where I am on Twitter, that's where my domain is and all that stuff. And you can actually find the slides for this talk at davidbhayes.talk/wp-sec-user. They'll be up there basically forever. So with that, quick summary of who I am. So I run a site called WPShout. Its logo is up in the top left of my slides. And WPShout is basically a free resource for the most part. We do offer some paid courses, but we're all about making better WordPress developers. That said, I've been using WordPress for 10 years and have tons of experience with it as a user as well, because you can't be a developer without being a user. Last fall, winter, I'm not sure exactly what timeline, I wrote a course called WordPress Security with Confidence on exactly the topic of site owner security. It also delved more into the developer side than we'll get to tonight. So check that out. It's on courses.wpshout.com if you're interested in that. It is a paid course. I also just recorded for Skillshare, which is a membership learning community, a version of this talk, essentially broken down into more bite-sized videos and slightly more actionable than this talk will be, which is going to be all slides. But you can definitely check that out on Skillshare. So first thing I want to go through pretty quickly is what I term myths people believe about WordPress security. There are just a common number of them. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but I think it gets you a start of understanding how I think about WordPress security differently than most people. So the first thing that I consider a myth is the idea that WordPress is not secure. And this is super, super common out there in the world, especially among people who are selling solutions other than WordPress. So if people want to do custom development for you for a website and someone else is offering you WordPress, the person offering customer development, one of the most likely things they're going to pull out is, well, WordPress isn't secure. And this is what we in the industry often call FUD, which stands for FUD, or fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And it's kind of a quick name you can give to anything where someone is basically offering fear rather than information. So they aren't telling you anything useful. They're just kind of injecting some uncertainty because they don't have actual concrete information. The other thing about this myth that's important to realize, though, is I'm not insisting that every WordPress site out there in the world is secure. Rather, there is this thing that is a zip file that you download on WordPress.org. And if you put that on your own web account on GoDaddy, Bluehost, SiteGround, WP Engine, what have you, it also auto-updates. And that, I think, is a pretty secure thing, but you might use insecure plugins in that environment or something like that. And in that case, there's not really salvation to be found in the idea that WordPress is not secure as a myth, because an insecure plugin is insecure in all situations, regardless of where you're coming from. So I would say that WordPress not secure isn't going to mean that your WordPress site is inherently secure either. Another thing that is very, very common is that people who are just hobbyists, tinkerers, that kind of thing, say, well, no one wants my site. So they think that for whatever reason, they don't need to worry about their site's security because nobody cares. And this is just completely untrue. There are so many reasons, as we'll get to in a bit, why people would want every site on the internet. So just to pick one example off the top of my head, almost every WordPress site can send you emails. It sends you an email when you get a new comment or when a comment is held for moderation. And those emails, that email sending capability can be used to send pharmaceutical spam or what have you. So that is one reason that even if your site gets no traffic, has no visitors, doesn't make you any money, even if all of those things are true, a spammer still wants your site so they can use it. So people want sites for reasons independent of they have high Google rankings and get lots of traffic. So you aren't secure merely by your site being unpopular or obscure. Another very common myth that's receded a little bit in the last few years as people have started to come to terms with it, but I still hear out there on a pretty regular basis, is the idea that just edit your htaccess file and block, Russian IP addresses or Canadian ones or American ones for that matter. There's no reason that an American would visit my French site. So the idea is that you can block specific countries and somehow that will add to your security. And it's just totally fallacious. It is trivially easy for me as a technically savvy person to get a new IP address, whether it be within my same country or within the world. So it's easy for me as an American to get a Russian IP. I can do it in like 3 seconds. I can switch to a Canadian IP or a Mexican one. Blocking countries isn't useful because of how easily and how arbitrary IP addresses are. It's pretty easy for anyone who knows what a VPN is, and I would tell you that most attackers do know what a VPN is, to make an IP appear from anywhere, and so it's just not a useful tactic, but it is common, especially for people who, have been doing this for 10 years, and it was more commonly advised 5 or 10 years ago than it is now. Another common myth that I think is based on a good idea is that WordPress.org plugins are somehow secured, or WordPress themes are somehow secured. And there is some auditing that goes into being on WordPress.org, and there would be some obvious things that would trigger hey, you can't actually put this plugin on here, it's not secure. But those reviews are limited in time and scope by the nature of WordPress.org being a volunteer project. And so no plugin or theme is thoroughly security audited. I don't think that they're inherently insecure because there is no security audit in that process, but nor are they completely secure. You can't just say, oh, it's from WordPress.org, therefore it's secure. That's just not true. The process is more human and fallible than that, for better and for worse. Similarly, you can't just assert that because you paid for a plugin or theme, therefore it's secure. This kind of goes hand in hand with the idea, well, WordPress.org is vouching for the plugins and themes. Similarly, well, Theme Forest or Code Canyon or whoever is vouching for the security of this plugin I bought. And that just is not the case. They're selling you the usefulness of that plugin, the fact that it adds contact forms or lets you build quizzes or whatever it is in that vicinity. That is what they're selling you. They're not necessarily selling you security. We'll go in towards the end of this talk into a little bit of detail about how you should think about making sure that plugins and themes are secure, but neither paying for them nor getting them from WordPress.org guarantees that they are secure. Another common myth is that you don't need to run updates. And this myth is more because people fear updates than that they actually have heard this from anyone who has an informed opinion on this topic. But update. We'll go into more detail about that later, but it is the single best thing you can do to make sure that a site is secure. Unquestionably, I think the current version of WordPress is 4.9.4. Unquestionably, I know that within a year's time, there will have been a security problem in WordPress 4.9.4 that's found. And if I don't upgrade to 4.9.5 or 4.9.6 or whatever the next security release of WordPress is, I know that my site will be insecure. So I need to run updates for that reason. There's just no way around it. WordPress 4.9.4 was the result of human processes, and human processes almost inherently will have errors in them. And you just have to understand that updating is part of that process to ensure that you take account for the fact that people will sometimes make errors. You need to run updates on a regular basis. Another very common myth is that security is just a green lock icon, both as common education for consumers and as common site administration confusion. When you go to Amazon.com and you see that green lock, in your browser, it's very useful and it is a good security signal to you. It tells you that your connection to Amazon is secured, but it doesn't tell you that Amazon doesn't have someone like lurking around its data center stealing all the credit card information, or same with any site. And similarly, updates still matter if you have an SSL connection. HTTPS does not prevent the fact that your site could be like forcing malware down other people's throats. Like that is a totally different process than securing your website. It's about communication between the client and server. And again, I'll get into this in a slightly more detail later in the talk. But for right now, you just need to understand that SSL does not inherently mean security. Another myth that is kind of pervasive in certain quadrants especially, it is most commonly peddled by people who offer security plugins for WordPress, is that, oh, you don't need to worry about WordPress security, you can just install a plugin. Similar but slightly different than this would be just get hosted on WP Engine, whoever is selling their security to you. Neither of these is sufficient. You can't just install a security plugin or just get good hosting and be like, well, my site's secure, I don't need to worry about anything. It just doesn't work that way. Even the most responsible plugin or host cannot make up for the fact that, Gravity Forms, I don't know what number, had some like egregious error in it that made it very commonly exploited today in the WordPress ecosystem. There's just no making up for that. The process of updating is how you make up for that. And so you need to understand that security is a holistic set of practices rather than a single thing you can buy from a security plugin vendor or a host or anyone else. No one can give you security in a single action. It just doesn't work that way. That's not how security should be thought of. This myth is so pervasive and so stupid that I have to list it, even though I think it's really dumb. And the idea is that if I hide the proudly powered by WordPress in my footer, or if I get rid of the header tag that says something like meta generator WordPress, somehow I'm making my site more secure. And it's just totally silly. If a hacker wants to guess whether or not you have a WordPress site, they can look for style.css and see if it says theme name at the start of that file, because that's a better sign than any of those things. So they just wouldn't rely on that. And honestly, I hear all the time from people who run like Drupal sites or Joomla sites that they're attacked at specific files that only exist in a WordPress installation. So a lot of the attackers that are out there attacking WordPress sites aren't even checking if it's a WordPress site. They're just attacking arbitrary URLs as if they were WordPress sites. So this is just a complete waste of time. It's a complete diversion. It's not something I would ever spend any time working on. To throw in a sidebar, they will also tell you to hide the specific version of WordPress. Like you shouldn't have it say 4.8.2 because that's insecure. But the solution there is to update to the latest version of WordPress rather than to hide that you're running an outdated version of WordPress. It's obviously the wrong solution to a complicated problem. Another common one is like move your WP admin or something like that. And the idea here is that like, they're going to look for files in a WP admin folder. Therefore, if you move or rename your WP admin folder, you'll be safe. This does actually provide some security. If you move your login page, for example, it's less likely that bots that are trying to log into your WordPress site will hit the right login page. So it does provide some benefit. But an outdated version of WordPress with outdated plugins that have known security vulnerabilities of them is not going to be solved by having relocated your WP admin folder or your WP content folder or your WP config file or anything. And that all of that is just of a piece with this idea that you just need to ... whatever it is, fill in the blank. My blank got truncated for some reason by my slide deck, but you just need to disable XML RPC. You just need to move the WP config.php file. You just need to set file permissions correctly. You just need to install a security plugin, install SSL. Like any of these things that people will tell you are myths because security is a holistic process rather than a single task you can do. There's just no single thing you can do that gets you there. Another myth is it an untouched WordPress site is secure? That you can just kind of spin up a site and forget about it and it's fine. As I hope you've understood by now, you need to be doing things like running updates and making sure that you have good passwords and so on a WordPress site. And so no old WordPress site that's untouched is likely to be completely secure. There are things that you can do on an untouched WordPress site that help. Auto updates are a big thing that WordPress has done by default for you, and we'll talk about them in a little more detail later, but those things help. But again, no old WordPress site is secure. In fact, more likely you should think of a site like that as defaulting to insecure than secure. Another myth is the very idea that you can just in a single step, a single process, a single checklist, secure your site. It's just not possible. I cannot guarantee that after you watch this talk and implement everything I suggest that you implement, your site will be secure eternally and forever. One of the complicated hard truths that people need to hear is that security is an ongoing process rather than a single point you get to. And this is both really easy to say and really hard to internalize. So many people want to, for a lot of good reasons, be able to stop worrying about things like how secure their online presence is. And it's just not possible. Security is an ongoing practice. Quantum computing is the thing that always leaps to mind for me. We're pretty sure, based on the theoretics of what quantum computing would look like if it arrived, and based on how we secure things today, that quantum computing breaks passwords and breaks HTTPS and breaks everything else. So if it were to be the case that suddenly someone was like, hey, we have a $1,000 quantum computer that you can just buy from us, it's quite possible that the entire illusion of security that we have now, based on the fact that quantum computers don't exist, would go away, because the way that cryptography works is based on factoring very large prime numbers, and quantum computers are probably way better at that than normal ones. So it's possible that anything could come along at any point that just is like, oh, no, we thought that worked before, but it doesn't anymore. So you have to keep that in mind and understand that it is an evolving process, security, rather than a one-time check mark you can never complete. So in order to really get to the heart of security, having dropped the myths, I want to talk about threat models. And threat models is kind of a general term whereby security people talk about it. And this applies to physical security as well as cybersecurity. And basically the issue is we need to understand everything that is a realistic threat to us in order to know how to secure ourselves. So for example, if you're a Secret Service agent in the United States, you need to think about who is threatening the security of the President of the United States. Well, it's crazies. It's like actual people who have mental health problems who are going to, because of this, the way the country works, be able to get a gun and possibly shoot the president. That is part of your threat model as a Secret Service agent. But if we tried to apply that as individual non-presidential security people, we'd be crazy if we worried about every random person with a gun. We just can't live our lives that way, because I want to go for a walk outside later. So it's important to understand your threat model. And because of the celebrity of the President of the United States, for example, the threat model is very different than it is for you or I, who have probably know people who are just like, well, that person's famous, I'm going to try to take them out. That's pretty dark, I realize, having just said it. But so we need to consider that for our site. So what actually is a threat to our site? Is it our cousin? Is it a guy you went to high school with who you never really got along with well? Or most likely it's botnets. So for 99% of WordPress sites, the most pressing threat without question is a botnet. There are a small number of sites where it's politically interesting to hack, again, the President of the United States website, or to hack the the Free Syrian Army's website or whatever. There are some people who political actors need to be figured into their threat model. But for most of us with most WordPress sites, especially ones that aren't high traffic, as we talked about earlier, the threat is botnets. That botnets will attack your site, and that botnets will be what your website gets turned into when it gets taken over. So botnet is basically a way to say, a mess of computers out there in the world that might be taking over other computers. A botnet is just a term for like, a hacker or a collection of hackers will, take over, Aunt Sylvia's old computer that she never uses but to play solitaire that is connected to the internet all the time. They'll happily add that to their botnet, and they'll happily add your WordPress site to their botnet if they can. And then they'll use that botnet to do nefarious things like send what's called a DDoS attack, where they just send overwhelming amounts of traffic to a specific site. Or they'll perhaps use it to distribute viruses or anything like this. Anything that you can think to do with a collection of computers that you can orchestrate and kind of puppet master your way around, you can do if you've got a botnet. So these are some of the reasons that people will use their botnet to try to take over any WordPress site. And this is where you can see that traffic doesn't super matter. So they might want to serve malware on your site. That is to inject down the connection of any arbitrary person who visits your site, if they can, a virus or something like that. However they can, they'll try to do that. Give the computer that is visiting your website bad stuff. They might try to shove down their ransomware. Or they might actually try to ransom your own site. So they might actually take over your WordPress site. I've never heard of this type of attack happening, but I can totally see where, two trends converge in it happening. So right now today, average Windows users often can have this experience where their site is where their computer is suddenly send 2 Bitcoins to this address or else we'll delete all your data. That's called ransomware. And it's totally conceivable that someone would implement that kind of attack on a WordPress site. Currently, like I said, I've never heard of that happening, but I could totally see it happening. Another reason that they might want to take over any arbitrary site is these hackers are just like communities in the same way that every other human community exists. And just as there are bullies out in the world in high schools and wherever, there are places where to prove your skills as like a cracker, a malicious hacker, you need to just take over a site and be like, hey, look, I took over the site and I put, whatever keyword on it or put my logo on it or whatever. That could be a reason they want to take over your site. They might also want to use your server resources. So, when you buy web hosting from GoDaddy, you're effectively buying some amount of server resources. They could conceivably try to use your server resources to mine Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever favorite crypto coin of the day it is. Or, again, to get back to the top, they might want to serve your visitors malware to mine crypto coins. They might want to just borrow your search engine rankings. So this relies a little bit more than some things on your prestige, the fact that Google thinks that your site is authoritative on, handbags. If you have any search engine ranking, it is possible that a hacker wants to use it to just forward all your traffic to them and then have Google ignore you in search engine rankings from then on. They might use your site to make a political statement, either that the Free Syrian Army is here and important, or that the Free Syrian Army is defunct, whatever it is. They might just want to hold your site for future use. If you've ever heard people talk about a backdoor, that's what they mean. A backdoor is just a way that a hacker can later come back and take over and use a site for use in the future. They might just want to put ads on your site or send spam messages from your site. And generally, they just want to use your server in a botnet. So they want to be able to take your server and add it to that botnet they've already got. So now that we've covered kind of the myths and the threats, I want to just talk about how I think about what you should do as an average WordPress site owner to make your site more secure. So the very first category of consideration is what I would call user account security. And this has many facets to it. But basically we're talking about, given that Michael can log into your site, how secure is Michael's account? That's what I mean by user account security. So the first thing that comes to mind is, how good of a password does Michael have? Is Michael's password Michael or Jackson or baseball? Anything like that, it's highly likely that a botnet pointed at your login page is able to say, well, Michael's username is Michael. I was able to find that through looking over the site. And therefore, I'm going to guess that Michael's password is Michael, and Jackson and Jordan and baseball and basketball, just obvious password guesses. And so this is where you just want to have good, secure passwords. There are many different ways you can kind of define a good password, but in general, the consensus is it is unique and long and somewhat not obvious. So it's not like, my username is Michael and my password is Jackson, because Michael Jackson was a pretty famous pop star. So it's something more like 5JQLS7, capital Q, right angle bracket. Like that is what you want as a good password, is something longer. Different philosophies exist. Like maybe some people will tell you should write full sentences with normal capitalization and punctuation, and that's really good passwords. I think they're great because they're long. They're probably pretty hard to guess, as long as your password isn't like the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog, or whatever that very common phrase people use to capture every letter in the alphabet is. As long as it's pretty unique, you're pretty good with any password that's more than like 16 characters long. The other thing is, it's really hard for people to maintain unique passwords over time, which is where a password manager comes in. Personally, I use one called 1Password. Immediately on my mind are LastPass and Dashlane, which are two other ones I hear people swear by. Depending on your team, your work environment, your different context, which password manager is right for you will vary. Some work better on iOS and Apple ecosystem, some work better in Teams, etc. But having a password manager is really good because it lets you not use the same password for Facebook and DeviantArt and Flickr and what have you, and instead have unique passwords per each service that you use. And it's just really hard for human brains to remember 17 passwords, but it's very easy for a computer to, and to do that in a way that is relatively secure. So password manager is something I highly recommend. I don't think I have a slide for it, but further upgrading would be two-factor authentication, where you have, a time series or just a text from a service when you log into your WordPress site. So you have to give not only your WordPress account password, but your some other form of authentication. That I think is overkill, and not enough people are comfortable enough with it for it to make sense as a recommendation on average WordPress sites. But if you are comfortable with two-factor authentication, if you appreciate the security of your bank texting you a code when you try to log in, I think it's definitely worth doing on WordPress site. The other half of user account security, as far as I'm concerned, is individual user accounts. So let's say that Michael wants to invite Susan to write a guest post on his site, and he wants to give her access to the site. He doesn't want to just get like a Google Doc or a text file. He wants to actually have her go in and write it inside of WordPress. Well, one way that Michael might think to add Susan to a site is to say, well, here's my account name. My username is Michael and my password is Michael Jackson is the best of all time, period. That is really bad, because now both Michael or Susan could inadvertently or intentionally take over that account and use it to do bad things to the other person. So you want to give Susan her own account. And because this is WordPress, you have what are called user roles. There are 5 user roles on a default WordPress site. Doing it from memory, I think it's subscriber, author, editor, contributor, and admin. I could be wrong about some or all of those. I think my order was a little off, but basically subscribers have almost no rights on a WordPress site, and admins can do absolutely everything, including deleting plugins arbitrarily. So you want to give Susan the account she needs, which is probably like a contributor or an editor at most, and not an admin account. So give each user their own account. And part of the reason to do that is, again, the least possible access. The principle of least access or least permission is very common. It's super common across all security circles. The US government uses it to not tell you what's in Area 51, and it's the same reason that you should give Susan an editor account if she's going to moderate comments for you, and not an admin account, which would let her, disable plugins, which you don't want her doing. The next thing that I want to talk about briefly is backups. I used to be like, backups aren't a part of security, but they absolutely are. They aren't going to prevent someone from logging into your WordPress site, but what they will do is minimize the harm that that person can do to you. If you have a backup off-site and they've deleted your entire web hosting account because they hacked you, then you're still fine. But if you don't have it, you aren't fine. So that is the part of backups that I think is really important. And the thing that I think about with backups that I only recently learned about, but I really like, is called the 3-2-1 rule. And the idea is you want at least one backup that is off-site, you want at least 2 storage types, and you want at least 3 total copies. And this is true across kind of every kind of backup, including your personal security. I think this rule came mostly out of personal data security, so the bits on your hard drive at home. But it applies very well here as well. So most web hosts offer backups. So they will automatically back up a site for you. Having had the experience, GoDaddy and Bluehost and whatever, they know that if they don't back up your site for you, the likelihood that you will be able to, keep your site in a good state over time is pretty low. So they'll automatically back up for you. So that takes care of one of your backups in that 3-2-1 scheme, but you should keep at least one other. And for me, that always means install a WordPress backup plugin. Updraft Plus is a pretty good free one where you can set it up to dump files into Google Drive or Dropbox or anything like that, which almost everyone has today. Pick one of those services that you already use and have Updraft Plus's free version do it. You will get some nags about please upgrade and stuff, but it works pretty well. Personally, I've been using Backup Buddy lately. I don't love Backup Buddy, but it works pretty well. Blog Vault is another one I've heard a lot about. There are lots of different ways you can get backups, but I think trusting your host to have a couple backups for you is fine, but you should still have at least one that is not under your hosting account, because a social engineering attack on your host could succeed and take you out. But if you also have it in your Google Drive account, you're much more secure that way. The next question that people often ask around security in my experience is, how do I know that a plugin's secure? We talked about how WordPress.org doesn't guarantee that a plugin is secure, and neither does buying it from a commercial vendor who is selling you specifically plugins. And unfortunately, as a WordPress user, someone who can't get in there and audit the code and be like, oh, I see a cross-site scripting vulnerability here, better fix it. Given that you can't do that, your best bet as someone who's concerned about security is actually to rely on the role of security in someone's reputation. So you're basically down to trusting plugins based on their reputation. You're trusting that, say, Yoast SEO is probably going to address a security vulnerability that's reported to them, whereas you might not trust XYZ, offshore developer company Inc. to do so, because you recognize the reputation of Yoast SEO and trust it in a way that you don't for XYZ development company. So, in general, on WordPress.org plugins, there's what I think of as the square or rectangle of credibility or reputation. So, I've got these 4 criteria. They've made it super simple because these are the things that we've been referring to for decades as how you think about how good a plugin is, and now you can just do it right there in this little box. So, in the top left, we've got star ratings. In general, star ratings are a poor but necessary correlative to how good something is. Personally, I take more stock in the number of ratings that have been given in a star rating system than in the total score of them. I would rather have a 4-star rated plugin with 10,000 reviews than a 5-star rated plugin with 2 reviews. So, you kind of have to balance those two things right there, the star rating versus the number of reviews. But in all cases, I think that is a pretty good sign. Again, not of security. None of these star raters is assessing quality from a security perspective. They're assessing overall quality in whatever ways they care about. But someone who bothers to release a 5-star plugin is probably going to care about security issues when and if they arise. The next number is probably the one I personally take the most stock in, although it's, again, still imperfect, which is the number of active installations. You used to have to rely on download counts, but active installations is how many sites does WordPress.org, as the source of updates that people ask, hear that, a Kismet in this case is being used. So active installations is a really good metric for, are people installing this plugin and continuing to keep it installed because they find it valuable. The other two on the right side I find a little less useful. It tells you how recently the plugin was updated, which is a good proxy for how frequently you would expect that someone would update a plugin if they heard that there was a security issue with it. But that's really where you're getting there. And I use some plugins that haven't been updated for 5 years, but I know they're secure. I trust them entirely. I've personally audited the code in these cases and seen that it looks very much like what I would write myself, and so I just use it because it's up on WordPress.org. Compatibility is even less useful to me than updating because this is plugin author assessed compatibility, but when you see that check mark, it is a good sign that probably this plugin has been updated recently because they're saying that it's compatible with the latest version of WordPress. Because you're running the latest version of WordPress, of course, which gets to the point of updating. As I've mentioned a couple different times now, software is a human process. And it's really important to realize that and accept that human processes have errors in them. This is why it's so important to update everything. Update your desktop operating system, update whatever. The reason that like Microsoft and Apple nag you on your desktop to please let them run updates is because they know that they've probably made security errors at some point. And so a lot of the updates that they will push to you might have security implications. And updating is the easiest way you can make sure that every security issue they've ever heard about has been patched. Obviously, there's a possibility of regressions and all of that stuff. But updating is the best proxy you have for making sure that they're there. As long as you trust the person releasing the update, you should always run that update almost as soon as you can. It's slightly different for new feature releases. You know, when Windows 11 comes out, it'll be slightly different than when Windows 10 has an update. But when Windows 10 has an update or when WordPress 4.9 has an update, always update, always. Which gets to the point of always leave auto updates on in WordPress. So WordPress 4.9.4, which is the current version, will probably have a security release at some point. And you want WordPress to be able to just take care of it in the background, update to WordPress 4.9.5. This won't affect any features. Nothing will break, most likely, when this happens. And so you want to leave auto updating on for minor versions. The way WordPress auto updates work, they won't update you to WordPress 5.0, which has much more far-reaching implications. But just don't mess with the default WordPress install, and it'll take care of auto-updating in 99% of cases, and leave that on. The other thing is that you also want to update your plugins. Now, I'm not going to insist that you turn on auto-updating for plugins. There are either plugins that can turn on auto-updating for plugins, or you can do it in code. But I think you absolutely have to update your plugins on a regular basis. If you can't do weekly, which I would recommend, personally, like I have a site that I publish on Tuesday. Every Tuesday before I hit publish, I go and update all the plugins that are on it. If you don't do that, at least plan to roughly monthly log into your WordPress site and make sure that it gets up to date. Gravity Forms a long time ago did have, again, because it's a human process with human errors, did have a release that had security implications. People who didn't update to it, because Gravity Forms was a widely used plugin, have had their sites taken over via that vector. Same with, there's a very famous one called the Revolution Slider or Tim Thumb. There are also tons of minor ones I can't think of off the top of my head or name, but plugin updates are super important because they're where a lot of code goes into WordPress that isn't part of the core update process, and so is more likely to have security implications that you need to update. Now, security plugins is a giant topic area. I think in general, security plugins are something where getting one is a good idea, but understanding that it's not perfect is also a good idea. So the ones that come to mind immediately for me are Security, which is as much a service as a plugin. WordFence. There's one called Malcare, which is new that I haven't heard much about. And then iTheme Security. And then to a certain extent, I think SiteLock, although SiteLock is quite expensive. But picking one of these services is a great idea, and I highly encourage you to do it. I have a table that I'm working on getting online at, I think I'm going to put it at wpsecuritycompared.com. But the idea there is that, you have Malcare, and how does it compare with Security? Well, they have different features that they include. And the choice of features is a little bit technical and far more than I want to get into right now. To give you just one example though, Securi is a plugin that includes what's called a web application firewall. And this will do things like block bad IPs that it's seen attacking other WordPress sites by trying to log in a lot of times, for example. It will, if someone who is trying to log into a different site lots of times with lots of password guesses, if it sees that IP roll over to your site in a short time-constrained window, it will actually block it for you. That's a really cool feature, a valuable feature that you would totally want. But iTheme Security doesn't have that feature, but it has comparable features that help you make a WordPress site more secure. So I would generally say if you think you want one of these, you probably should try one and just see what its features are, see how they feel to you, see which ones you feel like gave you value. But personally, I rarely run a security plugin. I'll often run one called Limit Login Attempts, but other than that, I don't run any on most of my WordPress sites, and I never have issues because I'm making sure I have good passwords, because I'm making sure I'm up to date, because I'm making sure I'm only installing plugins that I have reason to trust and not just random ones I got off the Pirate Bay or however you pirate software today. So I think security plugins are a good tactic, but I don't want to go into detail about each of them and compare them side by side right now. I think this is one of the last things I want to talk about is HTTPS, SSL, however you want to talk about it, that little green lock in your address bar in your browser. And this is a useful thing to have on a WordPress site, and in the last few years, primarily via an effort called Let's Encrypt. It's become very common to have totally free HTTPS available on a hosting account. So I just turned this on a Bluehost. A couple sites I host on Bluehost and have done for years. I commonly install HTTPS sites at no cost to me in SiteGround via their WordPress installer script. Either of these work great, and if you have an existing site in either of these scenarios, installing HTTPS is great because it encrypts and makes it harder for the CIA or just a bad actor at a coffee shop to snoop on that communication channel between your site and your visitor. So, passwords are more secure, credit card details are more secure. But that said, HTTPS is not going to take care of an outdated plugin that is being exploited by a botnet. Like, those two things are beside each other. So HTTPS is really good for e-commerce security. It's really good in general. And if you can, I would totally install it. But I do want to make clear that it is not complete security. It's just about that channel between a browser and a server, and nothing else on the server, for example, is more secure because of HTTPS. The last point I want to make is just one of the easiest and most uncommon steps for securing a WordPress site is to just visit it regularly. Log in, click around, click to the update screen, go ahead and run the updates, make sure that things still work. Be in there on a regular basis, making sure that it's not making you download files, making sure that random, front page views aren't throwing you somewhere else. And if you do that, a lot of the rest of this starts to be taken care of automatically. You will run updates if you're visiting your site regularly. So whether it's a brochureware site for your dental practice or something that you're trying to make money with, it's really important that you just be around your site. It's one of the simplest but most powerful security steps you can take. And with that, thank you. Since this is on YouTube, you have to like and subscribe. It's required if you sat through this 30 or 40 minute, maybe 50-minute talk. So please do. Cheers.